The Labor Department finalizes an edict to restrict the work kids can do on farms, but then it changes its mind. Stopped cold in its tracks. I'm Allen Barton. Stand by for Front Page. Joining me in studio, Keith Lockitch, fellow at the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights, and Terry Jones, associate editor for Investors Business Daily. All right, the Department of Labor was finalizing a rule that would apply child labor laws to family farms, prohibiting kids from work, quote, in storing, marketing, and transporting of farm product raw materials. Then, late Thursday, the Department of Labor withdrew the rule, as apparently thousands of comments opposing the rule flooded in. So, score one for citizenry being able to affect legislation. How about that? Terry, what do you think here? What were the details of these edicts that they wanted to ban children from working on farms, and how did they manage to stop it?
Well, basically, they wanted to stop them from working on anything other than a family-owned farm. Now, you say, well, that sounds reasonable. Well, they shouldn't be exploited by somebody else. But this would have potentially excluded your uncle's farm.
Yeah, because it was like within the immediate family and wholly owned.
That's right.
Like that. So if your father and your uncle shared the farm, you couldn't work there.
That's
all
right.
This typical government.
Or if you owned, a third interest in a field somewhere, they couldn't work in that field. And this is ridiculous. This is once again another example of the government's propensity for micromanaging the private realm. And this is, it's a never-ending trove for those of us in the media, because this is something that the Obama administration tries to do nearly every other week.
Keith, people who want these laws in place say, look, at the turn of the century, progressive laws like this and child labor laws helped save the lives of children. There are industries during the industrial, late 19th century here, and then you go to third world countries where children are exploited. They're working 20 hours a day in highly dangerous areas. They're being poisoned. They don't have a power base. They don't have political advocacy. What's wrong with child labor laws?
Well, this is the whole mythology, the whole distortion of history that we get on this issue. It's the idea that bad child labor practices were stopped by government intervention, by child labor laws. The truth is exactly the opposite. It was industrialization, it was capitalism that put an end to any bad child labor practices there were, because basically, what the Industrial Revolution did, it increased the productivity of labor, it increased wages, it drove down the cost of living so parents could afford to look after their kids. They didn't have to send them into the workforce. They could afford to send them to schools.
But wasn't there also sort of, as we said in another segment, the jackboot of government saying, if you have a kid work longer than 8 hours and or starting to put age limits on it, you're going to have the jackboot of government on your neck, and that did affect good change. Kids were sort of forced out, and industries had to adopt because of the policy. That's the other side of the argument. It wasn't just standard of living came up and people's kids didn't have to go to work. It was punishment.
Actually, as a matter of fact, starting with the steam engine and a number of other really great inventions in the 19th century, productivity on the nation's farms has soared. It's one of the great untold and unappreciated stories of human history. As one of the crawls showed, our labor force is less than 2% of it is involved in agriculture. At the turn of the century in 1800, roughly 98% of our population was involved in some way in agriculture. So we have shifted people from a life of extreme hardship and toil to a life of, let's admit it, relative physical ease, and we're all getting obese as a result of it. But our food has never been more plentiful. It's never been more cheap than it is today, and that's largely due to investments made by companies. It has nothing to do with the government mandating that children not work on farms.
Last question. This is something unusual in the sense that the people were able to stop this through flooding the government, which it gave me a little bit of like, oh, isn't that nice? We can still have an effect. What do you think of that? Because, they say thousands. That seems very small to me in terms of thousands of people being able to change the monolithic Labor Department and their idiot policies.
Yeah, well, as a senator once said, he said, they asked him why he changed his vote on a key issue, and he said, well, I got an overwhelming response from my constituency. And they said, oh, really? How many? He said, one. I got a letter. Sometimes bureaucrats get really spooked, and when they're used to doing things in silence without absolutely no response.
That's why this caught my attention, because this was not a congressional act, see, where you can flood your congressman's lines and his re-election is threatened. This is a bureaucrat in a department, in a monolithic department. How does it that was stopped? That's what impresses me.
They were overwhelmed by this, and they suddenly saw the anger, I mean, real raw anger out there about this.
Yeah, because kids weren't going to like be able to ride the tractors and do all the stuff that 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old kids do all the time on farms to learn skills, work, earn money, all the things that people do. Keith, I was sort of impressed that they were able to.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think we should be too impressed with a momentary lapse of unreason on the part of the Labor Department. This was so egregious, and the reaction was so overwhelming. I don't think it's too surprising.
Yeah. All right. Well, good news though. Thank you, gentlemen. For Keith and Terry, I'm Allen Barton, and you've been watching Front Page.